Welcome to Climate Quickies, bite-sized nuggets of climate goodness from our TEDxLondon experts in under 5 minutes.
In this week's Quickie, we speak to Akil Callender, a clean energy specialist. He shares how we can ensure a just energy transition in developing countries, whilst making sure that they have access to the same opportunities industrialized countries have had in the global north over the past 100 years. Let's head over to Akil to tell us more. Stay curious.
My name is Akil Callender. I'm the youth specialist at Sustainable Energy for All. Sustainable Energy for All is a UN partner organization that focuses on achieving the 7th Sustainable Development Goal, clean, reliable, modern, and affordable energy for all. How do we make a just energy transition in developing countries? So, first of all, I'd like to lay a bit of context. If we look at the main historical emitters, the USA and the European Union, and the more recent emitter, China, these three groups cumulatively account for 55% of global greenhouse gas emissions. In comparison, the entire continent of Africa accounts for only 3.8% of greenhouse gas emissions. So you can see the disparity there. Yet, Africa is at the forefront of the climate crisis and is one of the most vulnerable regions when it comes to the impacts of climate change. We know that energy is critical for addressing the climate crisis. Greenhouse gas emissions from the energy sector account for 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So we need to address energy if we are to address the climate crisis. And this means shifting from systems which utilize fossil fuels and transforming the global energy system to one that uses low carbon energies. The just energy transition means that we do this while ensuring that no one is left behind. And we need to taking into account vulnerable groups such as youth, women, indigenous populations, and the many people in the global south that are at the forefront of the climate crisis. We often hear about the just energy transition spoken about in terms of current workers in the fossil fuel industry and making sure that they're retrained and reskilled. But we often don't have the narrative that involves all the other people, the people who don't have access to energy, of which there are 733 million, most of which are in sub-Saharan Africa. The people who don't have access to clean cooking, of which there are 2.4 billion. And if we leave these people behind, then we can't actually say that we've achieved a just energy transition. We need to make sure that there is support, that there is funding, that there is policy that is robust. There is this notion, it's understandable why it's there, because it's an ethical dilemma. Developed countries have been able to use their fossil fuels for the last 150 years, maybe since the last industrial revolution, to get to the point where they are today. Developing countries have not had that opportunity, and it's understandable that they would then want a chance to industrialize, to develop. But we need to take climate change into consideration. If all developing countries have the opportunity to produce and expand and build based on fossil fuels, we can set a very dangerous precedent of lock-in, where technologies, infrastructures, etc., are locked into a fossil fuel basis, as we see in developed countries, and this can basically derail our progress to meeting climate targets. So if it's expected that developing countries, instead of using fossil fuels, leapfrog and don't repeat the same mistakes that developed countries have made in the past, which contributed to the climate crisis, there needs to be support. There needs to be a lot of financing. There needs to be technology transfer flowing from developed countries to developing countries to enable them to make this transition to leapfrog, to develop using cleaner energy technologies. If this is not there, then we cannot really ask developing countries not to use their indigenous resources to develop. One might argue that there's actually no reason to use the fossil fuels because renewable energies offer a better, cheaper resource. And I agree with this. However, developing countries often are faced with multiple different competing priorities or crises. They don't have the financial resources to just put a lot of money straight into renewable energy. Usually they're dealing with their own development agenda. They're dealing with the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. They're dealing with the impacts of climate change. If we look at the flooding that happened in Pakistan in September 2022, there was $30 billion in economic damages. And we can't expect Pakistan to then use this money that it needs to rebuild. That it doesn't even have, by the way, to then pump that into renewable energy. Back in 2009, the developed world got together and they pledged $100 billion toward climate finance for adaptation and mitigation efforts in developing countries. That money is still not materialized. So we need to work on this. And I think that's the only real way you can ethically ask developing countries not to produce their own resources. So there's a question on if the climate crisis can be won in developing countries. The truth is, in my honest opinion, the onus needs to be on the global north who have caused this problem. If the countries in the global south collectively were able to decarbonize, and this is maybe with the exception of China, we would still not be anywhere near where we need to be in terms of greenhouse gas emissions reduction. So if we look at Costa Rica, for example, which has amazing climate policy, is like a leader in that regard, and is almost 100% renewable, or has been at certain points in the last few years, the electricity sector. But this is just one example of a country that has built long-term policy well to allow it to do this, and I don't think many of the the countries in the developing world have even been independent long enough from colonial powers to do that. The USA, China, and the EU account for 55% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So they need to lead. And I think once these actors lead, the rest will follow.
Thanks for listening to this Quickie.
This episode was created by our superstar podcast team at TEDxLondon and supported by our headline partner, the global bank, Citi. Until next time,
Stay curious.